Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Arab Film Series. My name is Jinu Shweri. I'm the film curator at Arte East, and it's a pleasure to have filmmakers Malek, Rasamny, and Matt Peterson with us today for a discussion about their film Spaces of Exception. This program is part of the Arab Film Series, a monthly curated online program of contemporary and classical films from the Swana region and its diaspora, including discussions with artists and filmmakers connecting a worldwide community through film, dialogue, and activism. I would like to thank our partners, the Arab American National Museum and the Arab Film and Media Institute, for their partnership on the series. You can learn more about upcoming programs and our partner organizations on arabfilmseries.org. And I would like to introduce our filmmakers today. Matt Peterson is an organizer at Woodbine, an experimental space in New York City. He co-directed the documentary features Scenes from a Revolt Sustained and Spaces of Exception, and co-edited the books In the Name of the People and the Mohawk Warrior Society. Malek Rasamny co-directed the research project The Native and the Refugee, the feature film Spaces of Exception, and is the co-editor of the upcoming publication The Mohawk Warrior Society, a handbook on sovereignty and survival. He is currently a doctoral candidate in the Department of Social Anthropology and Ethnology at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. So welcome both to the program. Thank you for being here. It's a big pleasure. So you can unmute yourselves. Thank you. Yeah, no, it's a great pleasure to have you both here. I'd like to start by just asking you, the basic introduction question of how you started on this project and how you started this collaboration.
Well, Matt and I got to know each other in New York City in the 2009, 2010 time period. We would run into each other at a lot of different circles, politically and political activist circles, also in independent film circles that were happening. And so we got to know each other around that time. And Matt was starting a film collective at that time, a radical media film collective called Red Channels, which I became a part of right at the very beginning. And throughout many conversations that he and I had, we had this idea of kind of this dual comparison. One is this comparison of Palestinians and Native Americans as being two people who have a struggle that's really rooted on land, where the colonial power or the dominant power, if you will, has kind of desiring their land and pushing them off their land. And that obviously brings into comparison the settler colonial features of the United States and Israel. But then the more salient comparison that really was in the back of our heads was the space themselves of the reservations and the refugee camps as these kinds of quasi-sovereign spaces, if you will, within the nation states. And we're thinking about Indian reservations in the United States. And I was thinking about Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, where originally from where I went to high school. And so that was kind of on the back burner for a while. And then it was in 2014 that Matt proposed to really seriously begin working on this project. And it just went from there. And we started traveling and we started making short videos, and it kind of went from being a documentary into a kind of a bigger multimedia sort of research project, in a way that the path became even bigger than the destination somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, we were both interested in these spaces, and growing up and living both in New York City and Beirut, feeling like very interested in different political movements in the cities we live in and, our countries, obviously, but then realizing that there were these spaces that we weren't familiar with, that like people didn't normally go. There wasn't a lot of media or documentation about, and these peoples that are kind of constitute a big kind of base of the political situations, both in the US and Beirut, and the histories and et cetera. And just feeling like it was a bit strange, both for us individually, but also more broadly, like culturally or politically, that there were these people and places that you just didn't really see or know about. And that was really just our curiosity at the beginning to kind of think about what that meant, that there were these invisible spaces and these kind of hidden struggles that weren't typically what you would hear or think about in like political meetings or events or spaces or things like that. And thinking of them as like living contemporary communities was a big part of our project as well, to not just historicize like indigenous movements, centuries ago, or the kind of more romantic, sexy kind of idea of the Palestinian movements in the 70s or something. But it'd be like, what's happening now in 2014 or 2022 was always a big part of our project. So even though we were interested in doing like research and looking at archival materials and films and videos, most of our project was this kind of encounters and dialogues and conversations and collaborations with people in these spaces, working in these spaces today. And, that was a big part of what, how we decided to work and operate, but, what we really decided to put out as part of our project or something. And, in a way that was an intervention, both how we saw ourselves in New York and Beirut, and how we kind of saw or kind of want to think about what politics meant, in New York or Beirut or the United States or Lebanon or something, to kind of bring these spaces into more of a dialogue with what people had been talking or thinking about before.
Yeah, what you mentioned about, romanticizing or like focusing on the past, and the focus on the present. When I started watching it at first, I thought it would be something more of a poetic visual essay, with the juxtaposition of these different spaces, which was interesting because it opens also a sort of new space of reflection. But then it moved into a different form, aesthetic form. So I was just curious if you can, first of all, I'm curious about the archives that you use. If you can tell me a little bit more about that, and your choice in moving into a different kind of aesthetic form.
Well, as Matt was saying, I think a big part of the politics of the project was to look at what political or social questions are relevant today. What is the horizon today? Even though a big part of our the overall idea behind them, even the refugees, that there's this kind of unique history that is inculcated in the reservation and inculcated in the refugee camp that has a historical depth to it. But be that as it may, we were still interested in, it's not the 70s anymore. The movement, this is prior to Standing Rock, interestingly, but after the movement of, after some of the struggles that had occurred in the 70s and 80s and 90s in reservations. And then similarly with the refugee camp, you had this era of political struggle, of well-storied history in the 70s and 80s. But then, especially in the case of after the kind of establishment of the PA, after the Lebanese Civil War, even after the first Intifada, the situation of the refugee camp is kind of this forgotten space. So to understand what these political questions meant in the contemporary was very important. And so the aesthetic approach was very much about the act of doing. So if you see, we tried to favor people who weren't just telling stories, but kind of offering an analysis in the moment. And so the camera's always moving, we're walking around, we're driving around, we're moving around, and we're trying to interact with these spaces in the present tense as much as possible. The only times where we kind of forego that are very specific times, like the opening with the archives, the maps, and then when there's text. Those are the three times where we kind of eschew temporality, we jump outside of time, and we try and go for a pure historical or a pure geographic reflection. But then when the camera's rolling, the emphasis is really, on the present tense. In terms of the archives, we've had a somewhat long history working with archives, because part of the Native and the Refugee project, the big feature, maybe the central feature of the project, was a series of events that Matt and I did over the years, where we would showcase our short films, invite guest speakers, and have kind of group discussions in a variety of different spaces. And we started working with archives in 2015 in the summer at Spectacle Theater. We had this double event where we kind of showed archival. We wanted to make a gesture towards Matt and I, especially Matt, has a background in working with archival cinema. And so we wanted to kind of take a pause from the present tense and also do a little bit of reflection, not only on the history, but on the history of media representation. So even when we're looking at the past, it's not history per se, it's kind of the iconography of the past, which in turn is something that exists and activates itself in the present. So as a kind of gesture to that, we kind of put together 2 curated nights at Spectacle Cinema. And so we were kind of drawing off the work we did then when we designed the opening credit sequence that you saw in the feature film.
And I also, go ahead, Matt.
No, you go.
No, I was just also curious because you used some archival footage from Muhammad Malas, no, the dream. So I was also curious about that choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think, prior to making the feature film Space of Exception, we made about a dozen short films and videos, as we went, as each time we would visit a reservation or a camp, we would kind of make quickly like an edit of that material and kind of use that to show the next trip. And part of the project was this dialogue we were creating. So we would show a short film or video that we had made, a month before the next time we visited somewhere, and then have a dialogue and think about representation and what people thought or what was missing or what they wanted to include, or depending on what they saw or thought of, our portrait of a certain reservation or refugee camp, they would think, oh, like, you should shoot this, or you should talk to this person, or you should shoot this like this, or I want to talk about this dynamic or struggle. So there was that. And then, we were always interested in historical representation of reservations and camps. And we would do these events, like Malek was saying, where we would kind of show films that we didn't make and just kind of talk or think about them, or think about, the temporality, how certain questions were different, how the visuals were different or something. And that dream is a really beautiful, that film, The Dream, that you mentioned, is a really beautiful film because it's one of the few, and in Woodbine, the cultural center we helped run in New York City, we did a screening last June, during some of the, recent chaos or kind of atrocities that were happening in Palestine. We did a screening of these archival films as well. And that one is really interesting because it's one of the few films like that where it's not made for a Western audience. Mm-hmm. It's made, for Arabs or Palestinians or Syrians or whatever. So there's not this kind of pressure to kind of explain or do the history or say, in 1800, blah, 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 which you normally have to see when you're trying to explain the conflict, so to speak. You have to do this historical kind of mental gymnastic to kind of justify everything. And The Dream is really beautiful film because it doesn't do that. It just kind of enters in immediately and talks about different things, has a more poetic kind of lyrical, impressionistic way of thinking about, life in the camps and people and their situations. And as such, it's kind of shot and edited in such a way that kind of evokes that in a different way, where normally, so much of documentary is kind of dominated by journalism, this kind of dynamic of journalism, for better or worse, as opposed to like cinema. And, for us, we've always tried to straddle both of those, disciplines, to kind of have a dynamic where you're learning something or there's some kind of informational aspect of what's happening, but also to think about the kind of poetic or lyrical, impressionistic aspects of cinema, how shots are composed, how the editing is happening, how the narrative is happening. And then, like Malek was saying, we really wanted to emphasize analysis, a kind of political or social analysis of what life was like in the camps or in the reservations now, as opposed to normally documentaries, they'll focus on like character, like individual characters. There'll be human interest stories about like a young girl playing soccer or something like this, and like how beautiful and empowering it is that she's playing soccer, or whatever the story might be, And we really wanted to have a different kind of emphasis where the individuals we spoke to, in a way, it wasn't about them, it was about their ideas, and not some kind of sad story of their hardships or something like that, but like, how can we analyze the condition of the refugee or the reservation or the camp and these spaces in a very sophisticated, political, high theoretical way from the place itself. So not to do that within a university or an institution or something, to just go talk to some academic or a scholar living, in the ivory tower, but to go to the camp and be like, you explain to us what it means to be in the camp, or what the camp means politically and how it reflects on nationhood and statecraft and citizenship, etc. So that was kind of part of our thinking with the project.
Mm. And also, I read that you, in the methodology, you were collaborating with the participants. So it wasn't just coming in and just filming. So I'm just curious if you can tell us a bit more about, how you accessed this, how they had agency to their stories, rather than coming in with this journalistic approach. So yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off what Matt had just said, which also feeds into the answer to this question. I think oftentimes when people tell their individual stories, or when they're used as a cipher to kind of give background information, they're kind of not, in a way, oddly enough, by telling their own personal story, they're actually not themselves. They become like the standard example of X experience. And so actually they're kind of sublimated. Even in their individuation, there's actually a process of sublimation. So when you're actually looking at people and you're talking to them and you're forcing them not to, or you're trying your best to create a line of questioning that forces people to think in real time and not just kind of give these preconceived answers that are forms of self-representation that kind of are conditioned by a certain cycle of media. You know, we saw that very much in the West Bank, where there's a kind of expectation of what people want to hear. This is what you say. And we were always trying to escape that, and focusing on the camp became a way of escaping that, because we weren't asking about Israel. We were saying about the camp. What is the horizon for, what are the political issues in the camp? What is the horizon for your generation in the camp, politically and otherwise? So that, I think, was a useful way of turning away from that. In the Reservations, it was the opposite, in the sense that they were very aware of the typical media narratives, and they didn't want to participate along those lines. So for us, with the Reservations, the idea was that this wasn't, as Matt was saying about the Malek film, it wasn't for, the idea was creating a film where the audience was not supposed to be the typical American, whatever, white audience that you would have in the back of your head. But we kind of said, okay, the audience here is Palestinian for the films that are about Native Americans. And for the films about Palestinians, the audience is Native American. This isn't to say that it's only for them, but we wanted to like kind of position the films, and this is where we do draw from the past, position the films in kind of wider circuit of international solidarity that I think kind of existed a little bit in the 70s and 80s, where people were making films for like the Japanese Red Army and in Lebanon, where you're making films that are kind of decentering the West, and you're making films as part of a wider circuit of political film or political cinema. And so we tried to do something similar, where we were kind of inserting our films into that kind of into a circuit of solidarity that went beyond the average consumer audience. And I think expressing that was very important, particularly for the Native Americans, particularly in the Reservations, this idea that this was part of a process of exchange, actually. So Native people are showing, but then they're also receiving, because the idea was us coming back, showing films from Palestine, showing films from Lebanon, speaking about what was going on there, speaking about what we saw there. So kind of using the project as a conduit for the transmission of information and the transmission of experiences, rather than a mechanism where we come in, capture a certain story, disappear, and then release it to God knows who.
Right.
Yeah, I think also on the production methodology or the collaboration, part of it was like, because we were unfamiliar with the spaces, it would have been ridiculous for us to go in and say, you know, we want to see this or shoot this. Like, we would go in and be like, we would find, you know, partners or collaborators to help us effectively produce and direct the films, that people we felt some affinity with politically or socially, or there was some like resistance. Either in the Native context, there would be also more traditional people that were kind of protesting against the tribal governments that were kind of put in a kind of neo-colonial way by the United States itself, and served as a kind of, you know, puppet regime, so to speak, within the context of the Native nations. And then within the refugee, within the camps, it was often youth movements that were kind of trying to resist the kind of older generation of the political factions or something. So we would kind of find some of these people that we wanted to work with and be the kind of vessels or conduits through which, you know, we would kind of make the films. We would say, you know, what do you want us to shoot? You know, what should we show? Who should we talk to? You know, where should we film? Rather than us going in and say, okay, we need this shot, we need this interview, we need an old lady, we need a young girl, we need, you know what I mean? It wasn't like this kind of schematic, kind of cookie cutter thing. We would go to a place and be like, we've never been to this place. We don't know this place. You live here. What do you want to kind of transmit or convey of this place? What's important? And then, you know, as I was saying, because we had these short films we were making along the way, we would show them the films that we already had and be like, okay, we went to this reservation and we shot it like this, or we showed like this. And they would say, okay, you know, like in our case, we want to show this, or you should talk to this person because that's in dialogue with this, you know, this thing this person was saying, or et cetera, you know, this kind of dialogical thing. So then the films became this kind of back and forth. And then, you know, the feature film was a way for us, you know, Space of Exception, to try to synthesize or process this whole experience, you know, for 4 years that we have been doing, and kind of try to, you know, summarize it as best we could, convey as much as we could, you know, in 90 minutes or something, and kind of show these places. And, you know, because the whole nature of the project is this dialogue, or the juxtaposition between the reservations and the camps. You know, it's not just a documentary about Palestine, and it's not just a documentary about, you know, Native Americans or something. So the whole kind of concept or method was like, what do we show and what do we shoot that kind of informs somehow the kind of the next chapter or the next kind of section or something? And how do they kind of, but we never do that literally, you know, in the film, we never say that. There's nothing like literal, you know, doing that. It's just in the juxtaposition, how do they inform each other, add something to each other, or kind of make something more visible or not? You know, obviously there's a lot of differences or kind of disparities in the experiences, you know, temporally, you know, where they are, et cetera, you know, how the kind of colonization has happened in both places. But, you know, that was a big part of how we approached the project itself.
Yeah.
No, just to continue on that, you were talking about how one section informed the other one. I was a bit curious about your choices in terms of the editing structure of having kind of focusing on one community at a time, rather than kind of intersecting between different ones. And yeah, just to understand a little bit more what was the thought behind that?
Yeah, that was a huge question for Matt and I from the very beginning, where we were kind of going back and forth and debating that. So that was a question that was at the heart of what we were, you know, of what we were considering or thinking about. Ultimately, the reason that we chose to go with the segment-based approach is twofold. I mean, first, just quite simply, the problem is that central to the integrity of the project is maintaining the specificity of the different places. Because once you go to these spaces, you realize that their struggles are really micro. They have these micro struggles that are very intense, but very particular to that space. But obviously, in many ways, they're refractions of a larger political struggle. But still, you can't ignore the very particular local forms that they have in every place. I mean, there's particular struggles between different longhouses and the tribal government and the band council on the Akwesasne reservation. There's a very particular history in somewhere like Pine Ridge. There are very particular struggles among the individual refugee camps within Lebanon, let alone a conglomeration of the issues that the Lebanese refugee camps have that are different from the issues that are faced by Palestinian refugees in Jordan or in the West Bank. So I think the problem with cutting it back and forth, although it can be very poetic and evocative, on a discursive level, you would lose the integrity of the particular places. You would lose their specificity. And they would kind of mesh together and be like Native Americanism writ large and Palestinian writ large. And the whole focus on the individual spaces and their unique quality would be lost. And I think that would be, that's a problem, obviously. And then the second thing is also being that the Native and the Refugee was composed of this series of short films throughout the entire time, it was interesting for us as an exercise to kind of do an experiment where, you know, normally in montage, you put photos by other shots next to other shots. We were trying to achieve a montage effect of segments juxtaposed with other segments. So the kind of intervention of the feature film was to take what had been these kinds of single shots, these kind of single short films, but juxtapose them together. So kind of have this experiment in long duration, wherein segment builds on segment, builds on segment, builds on segment. So it's this kind of montage of segments almost that collectively produces this particular experience. And because we wanted to do something in the feature film that was both connected to, but also different from the shorter segments. So we thought about kind of having a compilation of short segments, all within the same framework, and then having that be kind of an appropriate for this project's feature film.
Okay, great. I mean, yeah, I could ask you more about this, of what exactly was this arc, in terms of what connected one segment to another, or we can leave it for the audience to just discover it in the film. I don't want to give too much away as well. Up to you.
Yeah, I mean, because otherwise, if we discuss it, then they'll kind of know the breakdown of which
Right.
goes where. So I'd rather keep that element, for the audience to find out. And then if someone's seen it, they're free to talk to us individually, and we can explain things more. But I wouldn't want to give it away before someone watches the film.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And tell me a little bit more about the title, Spaces of Exception. I know it's references some literature and thoughts, and I just wanted to know why you chose this title.
I mean, I think, we were thinking about these experiences of kind of settler colonialism and, the nation state as a kind of political paradigm or formation. And indigeneity and refugeehood are both kind of outside of this experience. One is sort of pre-nation state. The indigenous exist as a kind of people, before the formation or invention or kind of experience of statehood and citizenship. And then refugeehood kind of happens after the fact. It's the kind of the excess that can't fit within kind of nation states. And, you have these individual categories, the indigenous and the refugee. And then to give them a kind of spatial kind of experience is within the reservation and the camp. So it's this kind of exceptional space that exists within, current contemporary life, but outside of how, a certain political, governance is supposed to take place. So in a country like the United States or Lebanon or any of these places where this thing is sort of happening, you see these people in places that exist outside of kind of governance, outside of a certain understanding of jurisdiction, of law, of rights discourse, of kind of how the economy is supposed to work, how property relations are supposed to work. And I think that excess or that kind of exceptionality points to some of the limitations or contradictions of kind of the nation state or citizenship or kind of rights discourse or something. So by looking at these pre and post kind of conditions of indigeneity and refugeehood, you can kind of see, or kind of it explodes the whole construct or paradigm of like citizenship based on kind of statecraft and, how rights as we imagine them are kind of within this framework or something. So spaces of exception were, we're going to go to these places, the reservation and the refugee camp, as a way to kind of interrogate our own experience of citizenship of the United States or Lebanon, and what that means and what that leaves out and who that leaves out, and how these different spaces might be governed in a different way than we have experienced, or we might have these expectations or something. So, that was a big part of what we were thinking, how, the kind of conceptual or philosophical, political framework that we wanted to investigate within the film or something. It wasn't just about Palestine as such, or just about kind of native experience, but it was this conceptual thing about citizenship itself, or the nation state itself. What do those categories mean, and who do they leave out, and why do they leave them out, and what's the kind of history and kind of thinking within which, people are excluded from this kind of construct of governance that we experience or something. And, as refugeehood has kind of grown over the last, 10, 20 years and become, these crises, the refugee crisis, was this kind of discourse we saw in the US and the news over the recent years, and etc. And, ecological crises are kind of growing or something. And people like realize we no longer know how to live on the earth itself. We only know how to destroy it and extract from it or something. We see both of these categories having more currency of things that we can learn from about, the contradictions that we inhabit or we see all around us around these questions. What does it mean to live with the earth and not destroy it? And I think, people have been looking more and more to indigenous communities and populations to kind of think about those questions. And, as the refugee experiences, recently, in Russia and Ukraine, there's been more than 1 million kind of refugees displaced. And there's this whole new discourse around, people's willingness to accept, Ukrainian refugees, and why that is and what that means, and what kind of racial, ethnic category is appropriate for a refugee to have and what's not. The other dynamic that's been interesting is, for me, is, as people have been kind of canceling events and boycotting things in Russia, canceling cultural events, sporting events, performances in Russia, there's been this kind of contradiction or discourse, because when people tried to do that with Israel or something, there was this, resistance or reluctance to it. People like, it's clear why you should, why it's problematic or complicated to perform right now in Russia, you know what I mean, for obvious reasons. And I think, that experience of refugeehood and kind of domination and colonization, you see it in the news, but, with Native Americans and Palestinians, because they've been experiencing it, for 70 years or centuries or something, it's like, it's easier to point out, like these broader kind of structural things that are outside of the news cycle, so to speak. The Native American struggle is not something that's in the news because it's centuries old, But I think these conditions of like this exceptionality, that's what we wanted to kind of highlight with the film.
Yeah, if you look at some of Agamben's work where he talks about the state of exception, it's this, in a very simple form, it's this idea that kind of, at least my reading of it to some degree, is this idea of like where it's a space where law ends, or how we envision is where law ends and politics begins. And that's kind of what happens with the refugee camps and the reservations. They're a kind of space that is outside certain parameters of the United States or Lebanese or Israeli law. But then that's where real politics kind of begins, the kind of violence that in many ways is central to the American project, at the heart of the American project, at the heart of American expansionism, comes to the fore precisely in the reservations. It's in the reservations that we can understand certain aspects of the American project that aren't apparent when you're studying the history of the main subject of America. So it's when you look at the other, and particularly the other, and not just the other as a category, as a personal category, but the other in his space, because the reservations are not. It's not just that Native Americans are others, but the reservation is the other as a space. And so when these spaces that are both within America, within American sovereignty, yet outside of American sovereignty, they're not part of the states. They're kind of directly administered by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is part of the Department of the Interior, so the executive branch. They're these kinds of territories that in and out of America kind of reveal something about America that would only be possible at the place where America ends, but then also kind of begins. And it's the same thing with refugee camps in Lebanon. The Palestinian refugee camps, precisely because of their exceptional status, the fact that they were able to bear arms, like they were kind of outside of Lebanese sovereignty, allowed them to become a vector for domestic Lebanese political tensions in the lead up to the Lebanese Civil War. It was precisely the lawless, if you will, or the non-Lebanese aspect of the Palestinian refugee camps that allowed them to become a vector for Lebanese tensions in the lead up to the Lebanese Civil War. And we can see the same thing with Palestinian refugee camps in the West Bank, where a lot of times when the Israelis are trying to kind of begin the kind of extra-legal processes of detention or raiding of camps, they kind of hone those techniques in the refugee before they apply them to the non-refugee areas. Mm-hmm. So the kind of tactics, the military tactics, the tactics of detention, the tactics of intimidation, these are perfected in the refugee camps or in Gaza, which is majority refugee camps, as you probably know. They're perfected there before they're administered on the non-refugee parts of the West Bank, or before they're applied to Israeli citizens themselves. Obviously, I'm thinking about Arab, Black Israelis, or Palestinian Israelis, or Arab Israelis, other, forms of Israelis. So these kinds of processes, again, begin really in the refugee camps because they're these outside spaces that have an exceptional status, even within the occupied territories. And people don't realize that there is a sharp difference between the occupied territories as such, and then the refugee camps that are within the occupied territories. And then if you want to think of Gaza as a series of giant refugee camps, then that also helps us understand the exceptionality of today, which is this siege that has been going on for decades at this point, which is kind of unheard of. And you can't understand the idea of the siege of Gaza and the kind of forms of the kinds of forms of collective punishment, extra legal collective punishment that are allowed to happen in Gaza without understanding the fact that Gaza consists of refugee camps. The two are linked together. I mean, I could keep going on and on. You can see that in Yarmouk, where Yarmouk becomes one of the most destroyed parts of Damascus, even though precisely because it's a Palestinian refugee camps, it becomes this space for the Syrian civil war to enact itself in. And you see the same thing, of course, with refugee camps in Lebanon, where there are certain kinds of, even on a psychological level, certain kinds of forms of violence that happen in terms of abuse, alcoholism, that happen in the reservations because of its exceptional status, that in turn informs something deeply truthful about America as a whole. So they're outside, but in a way they couldn't be more inside. And that's what I think was interesting, and certainly interesting for me, that I felt that as an American and as a Lebanese, I couldn't understand both of my countries without going to both of those spaces. So calling the film spaces of exception came quite naturally.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of your choice of the actual communities, was it intentional, or was it based on just a process of access?
I think in the native context, Pine Ridge is probably the most iconic and historic reservation in the U.S. because of, the Wounded Knee Massacre, but also, the American Indian movement, occupation of Wounded Knee, and, the shootout with Leonard Peltier and the FBI. There's all these historic aspects, of the Lakota, a lot of the iconic imagery of native kind of folklore is from, the Plains Indians and the Lakota, and, the teepees and the buffalo and kind of horse riding and these kinds of things. So Pine Ridge really has this weighty, it's one of the largest reservations. It's one of the poorest parts of the country. So it has all of these extremes, but because it has this direct lineage and legacy to this 70s kind of militant revival of kind of native consciousness, we wanted to kind of think about, the remnants of that, and the kind of, the generational transfers of kind of resistance and consciousness there. So that was the obvious place for us to start the project, was to kind of go there. The Mohawk Reservation we focused on is interesting. It's one of the closest to us in New York State. Where the project was mostly based in New York City, and it's in upstate New York, but it has this really fascinating kind of dynamic where it spans the border of the United States and Canada, and then within Canada it spans the border of Quebec and Ontario. So it has all these contradictions of kind of colonization, the borders between these two countries, and then these provinces, and this river, and there's all these dynamics around like smuggling and kind of economic development that happens there, and kind of the transfer of people or weapons or drugs. There's this kind of fascinating thing that happens along the border there, and they also have this experience of a revival of native militancy in the 70s through the Mohawk Warriors Society. So that was interesting for us. And then the Navajo Nation is the largest native reservation and kind of native people in the United States. So that was very fascinating as well. So those were the three we kind of focused on. But, just in terms of that, there's more than 500, federally recognized native tribes, within the United States, which were all kind of separate nations, many of whom have different languages and customs and kind of belief systems, different land bases, different relationships to parts of, North America. So it also kind of points to the fact that there's all this difference. We just happen to focus on 3 spaces, but there's so many. And then, within the Middle East and the Palestinian experience, we weren't able to go to Gaza or Syria as part of our project because of the, political situations that were happening at the time we were shooting, which just made it too difficult for us to kind of enter into those. We did actually go to Jordan a couple times, but we really had difficulty accessing the camps. We were able to visit the camps and meet people, but there was a lot of resistance or reluctance to fully cooperate with us because of, fear of, persecution or oppression or kind of fallback from the government or something. So that was something we weren't able to incorporate within the feature film, but we're interested in it. that phenomenon within our broader project of these refugee experiences in these places that aren't represented. Lebanon, was the other kind of headquarters for our film in Beirut. So we went to a number of camps there, and then the West Bank as well. And, most recently, before COVID, we were able to make a short film about Bedouin communities in the West Bank, which is a kind of another kind of layer, kind of thinking about this experience of indigeneity and refugeehood. So it's not within the framework of a camp, a refugee camp, but they have a very interesting experience of what these questions mean. It's a kind of different framework or paradigm or something. So that was a film we released last year that's on our website or something. But that was part of the thinking going into, the different places we filmed and focused on and why. But we really wanted to focus on just a few to kind of give a kind of portrait or sense, but realizing that there's dozens, if not hundreds, more other places like this just within the United States and Palestinian experience, never mind if we were to kind of expand the idea of refugeehood or indigeneity globally. There's, thousands of different experiences or something, all of which, like I was saying before, points to this dynamic of citizenship and kind of the nation state being a very kind of narrow, constrictive and restrictive kind of way in which to view how the world works.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can echo what Matt said. I mean, with the native reservations, there was this kind of very purposeful selection, and then with the refugee camps, at least with Lebanon, and because reservations are very far, also, so you have to plan in advance which ones you would like to go to. Whereas the camps are closer together, and we went to many camps in Lebanon and the West Bank, and we shot a lot of footage in all of them. But we just chose what cinematically. Where the footage we thought worked the best or spoke the best. Whereas with the reservation, it was more in the pre-production stage, if you will. So one was more of a pre-production decision, the other one more of a post-production decision, production decision. And but there was also a lot of going back and accumulation of, for example, like things that weren't in the film, but like we also went to Standing Rock twice, which is a reservation that's not in the film. But we did shoot 2 short films there in the context of the project. And we visited several reservations in upstate New York and in Long Island and in Washington. And we kind of showed our work there, but we didn't necessarily always shoot there. It's always also a question of how much of the project, because there's like the project as shooting things, and then there's the project itself. So to what extent do you want to document the project itself? To what at what point do you always want to shoot everything, or at what point do you? And that was always a question. It's like, should we be shooting, or should we just because you don't want to shoot all the time, obviously. So you want to be part of a process that isn't necessarily about capturing footage. So it becomes a question of when do you shoot, when do you not shoot, when are you just in the moment participating, working together, demonstrating solidarity, and what other times are you kind of doing that as a filmmaker? And so that's obviously a question that we would go back and forth of at different points throughout the project itself.
Mm-hmm. And so this project, this film is part of, as you mentioned before, part of a bigger multimedia project, the Native and the Refugee. Is it something that's still ongoing? Do you have plans to evolve this? Can you share with us where you are with this right now?
Sure. The Native and the Refugee, within the context or framework of the refugee, we collaborated with a good friend of ours, Philip, who's at McGill, and Kahatanenta, who is a well-known Mohawk activist. We collaborated with both of them on a project about the Mohawk Warrior Society, which Matt mentioned earlier. So this book is kind of the first oral history of the Mohawk Warrior Society. We're publishing the work of Louis Hall, who was this well-known kind of Mohawk thinker, scholar, activist, leader. So we're publishing his written works and a lot of his paintings, and we're coupling that with a series of testimonies with some of the last surviving members of this group, who are featured. A lot of them are featured in the feature film. They're the people who are in the Akwesasne section, for those of you who watched or will watch the film. So yeah, I mean, the thing with the Native and the Refugees, it's so big, and there's these little micro worlds that you can go into. It's kind of like those a Dali painting or a Bosch painting where they're big, and then you go to a certain section, and then if you look closely, there's a whole world of detail within that one corner that isn't apparent when you're looking at it from the broad point of view. So we were also always both like thematically and artistically playing with this idea of like, how wide is our gaze going to be? Not gaze, that's not a good word, but how wide is our look going to be? Are we going to be looking at this? You can look at it extremely broadly, like Matt was saying, in terms of refugee and indigenous as these extremely broad civilizational categories, or you can get super micro and get into the particular history of a particular place and a particular set of people. So with the Mohawk Warrior Society, we had the opportunity with others to kind of unpack the details and the universe of one of those particular places, which is Akwesasne, and get into the history. So that book is coming out with PM Press in August, and then it's also going to be translated into French and be published in Canada and in France. So that's one output of the Native and the Refugee that's still ongoing. Another thing, again, in the realm of books is that Matt and I have plans at some point to write the book. We're working on the book, The Native and the Refugee. So just like there was kind of a film that kind of, I don't want to say summarized, but kind of was an output of The Native and the Refugee, there will also be a book on a similar scale that will also be an output of this project, although it will attempt different things than the movie does, because obviously there are certain things that are very appropriate for the film form and other things that are appropriate for a book form. So it'll kind of do what the film couldn't because of its form as a film. And so those are at least two things. There are many other ideas that we would have had that we've bandied about throughout the years, but those are some of the more concrete things that are continuing to happen as far as the Native and the Refugee is concerned. Mm-hmm. And then also even presenting our work, as we continue to present our work, continue to talk to people, that is the project for us. I mean, I could point to concrete things like a book or an exhibition or a platform, but the mere fact of showing this film in different places, being able to show the film to different communities, traveling around, presenting the work in South America, we'll continue to present the Native and the Refugee and Spaces of Exception wherever we're able to, and to have conversations around it. And those conversations in particular are really at the heart of this experience. So as long as that keeps going on, the Native and the Refugee survives or keeps going on as far as I'm concerned.
And how was the reaction, final question, when you showed it to the camps and the reservation? What was the reaction? And are they aware, I mean, how much are they aware of each other's struggles, and how did that inform their own?
I think it was interesting. At first, the Native communities were far more aware of the Palestinian movement or struggle because it's been so mediatized, the last 20 years or so. It's often in the news, in the American news at least, but it's often in the news, and people think or talk about it, and there's a kind of sympathy and solidarity for the resistance and the struggle. And I think it's one of these experiences of colonization or settler colonialism, which actually does get a lot of attention and visibility, for better or worse, as opposed to a lot of other kind of movements or experiences. So a lot of the Native communities we spoke to were kind of excited or curious about this exchange or dialogue, and we're happy to be put in connection with this kind of more current contemporary form of resistance or kind of critique of colonial expansion or something. But the Palestinian, at first there was kind of skepticism or reluctance because they knew a bit less about kind of Native resistance in America, and had this experience that like, oh, they lost, or they were all killed, or they all died off, or America just dominated the country. And then once we started showing them films of these people and their kind of resistance and kind of militancy and struggle and kind of clashes with the American, they're like, oh, wow, we didn't realize at all that there were still Native Americans, or there was still land or territory or struggle or resistance. So part of the project was kind of reviving this kind of experience of exchange or solidarity and kind of rebuilding it. But at first, there was a kind of reluctance or skepticism because they didn't want to be associated with someone who lost, to put it crudely or something. But that was something that I think for Malek and I, we were kind of grateful or kind of, happy to be part of that exchange or that transmission of experience, to share these kind of dynamics and think about, how does this experience of settler colonialism change over the decades or centuries, and how does kind of statecraft change and how it's kind of talked about or managed, you know, how land is managed, how these political categories are managed, how the media is managed in terms of like, you know, resistance or kind of armed struggle or terrorism or any of these questions, you know, how does it look like, you know, when you kind of transfer the narrative or the kind of the gaze, you know, from one place to another, or one time to another or something. And, you know, like Malek was saying, that's been one of the most satisfying parts of the whole project, was to kind of show these films in different contexts and talk to people about it and get these experiences, and also just show people themselves, you know, when they don't often have this experience, to see themselves on, you know, on camera, on footage, or talking or explaining. You know, that felt really, you know, gratifying as well, to kind of be able to do and share. And, you know, in 2019, you know, before COVID, we were able to travel the film in Lebanon and the West Bank and kind of do a tour. And because of COVID, we haven't been able to do that yet with the feature film in the US. So we're kind of still waiting or looking forward to that. But, you know, people have seen it online and kind of shared it around. And, you know, we're grateful for Arte East and everyone to kind of put the film online again and kind of spread it around and share it. And, you know, we're happy to hear anybody's reactions or questions. So yeah.
Where can people, actually, that's a good thing. Where can they contact you if they would like to share their thoughts? Is there, do you have a site or a platform that you can be reached at?
Yeah, we have a website. It's thenativeandtherefugee.com. And then there's a Facebook page as well called The Native and the Refugee. And people can contact us through either of those, you know, platforms, or, you know, just.
And there's also our email, thenativeandtherefugee@gmail.com.
Perfect.
So it's all quite simple. The Native and the Refugee on Gmail, on Facebook, and on the web.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Matt and Malek. That was really informative and rich discussion. And for our audience, don't miss the Spaces of Exception, and please get in touch with the filmmakers. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.